Ingrid Lindstrom stood at the edge of 60 acres of swamp and watched the autumn wind ripple across water that had killed her husband. Eric had been crossing the bog on a shortcut to town when the bottom gave way beneath him, sucking him down into black muck that held him until he stopped struggling. They found his body 3 days later, half submerged in water that smelled like rot and death. That was April. Now it was October, and Ingrid was the legal owner of the land that had swallowed him whole. "The surveyor says it's 62 acres, more or less," Carl Lindstrom said, standing beside her on the solid ground at the bog's edge. He was holding the deed like it was something distasteful, which to him it was. Father always meant to drain it, but he never got around to it. Too much work for too little return. And you're giving it to me. The law says Eric's widow gets a portion. This is your portion. Carl's face showed nothing, but his voice carried the satisfaction of a man delivering an insult he could pretend was generosity. "You're welcome to try draining it yourself, or you can sell it. I'll give you $50 for the whole parcel, save you the trouble." Ingrid looked at the swamp. It stretched before her in shades of brown and red and gold, the autumn colors of marsh grass and dying leaves. Here and there, she could see patches of darker red floating on the water's surface, clusters of small berries that the birds were already picking at. "What are those?" she asked, pointing at the red patches. "Cranberries. They grow wild in the bogs. The Indians used to harvest them, but there's no money in it. A few cents a bushel, maybe, if you can find someone to buy them." Carl shook his head. "Take the $50, Ingrid. Buy a train ticket back to Minnesota. There's nothing for you here." Ingrid took the deed from his hand and folded it carefully into her pocket. "I'll keep the land." She heard Carl's laugh as he walked away, the laugh of a man who had just given away garbage and watched someone treat it like treasure. She didn't turn around. She was too busy looking at the cranberries floating on the water, trying to count how many patches she could see from where she stood. The first winter was hard in ways that had nothing to do with the swamp. Ingrid lived in the small cabin she and Eric had built when they first arrived, eating through their stores of preserved food, burning through their supply of firewood, watching the snow pile up on the frozen bog and wondering if Carl was right. Maybe she should have taken the $50. Maybe she should have gone back to Minnesota, back to the family she had left when she married Eric Lindstrom and followed him to Wisconsin. But going back meant admitting that she had failed. Going back meant proving Carl right. And Ingrid discovered, during those long winter nights, that she would rather freeze in the swamp than give him the satisfaction. She found Joseph Clearwater in March, or rather, he found her. She was wading through the edge of the bog, the ice just melted, looking for the cranberry patches she had seen in the fall. She wanted to know where they grew, how many there were, whether there was any way to turn those few cents a bushel into something that could keep her alive. Joseph was standing on a sandy ridge at the bog's edge, watching her wade through the cold water with an expression she couldn't read. He was Ojibwe, one of the few who remained in the area after most of his people had been pushed north and west. He lived alone in a cabin on land that no one had bothered to claim because it was too wet for farming. "You're the Swedish woman," he said when she climbed out of the water, her skirt soaked to the knees. "The one they gave the drowning bog. I'm Ingrid Lindstrom. My husband died here last spring." "I know. I helped find the body." Joseph's eyes moved across the bog, reading something in the landscape that Ingrid couldn't see. "Why are you wading in the cold water?" "I'm looking for cranberries. I saw them in the fall, floating on the surface. I want to know if there are enough to harvest." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and started walking along the ridge, gesturing for her to follow. "Come, I'll show you what you have. Stay with me," because what he showed her is the reason she was shipping cranberries to Chicago while her brothers-in-law were watching their wheat prices collapse. The bog was larger than Ingrid had realized, and richer. Joseph walked her around the entire perimeter, pointing out the different sections, explaining what grew where and why. The cranberries weren't just in a few patches. They covered nearly 30 acres of the bog's surface, a wild crop that had been growing here for centuries, harvested by his people long before the Lindstroms arrived. "The berries need 3 things," Joseph said. "Acid water, which you have, sandy soil beneath the water, which you have, and cold winters to set the fruit, which you have. This bog is perfect for cranberries. It always has been." "Then why doesn't anyone grow them here?" "Because wheat farmers think like wheat farmers. They see water and they think drainage. They see bog and they think waste. They don't see what's already growing." He picked a handful of dried berries from a vine, the leftovers from last fall's crop that the birds had missed. "My grandmother sold cranberries to the trading posts for 40 years. Good money, steady money. The white buyers paid more every year because the berries don't grow where they come from." Ingrid looked at the bog with new eyes. She had been thinking of it as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be drained. Now she saw it as a crop already planted, already growing, waiting to be harvested. "How do I do it?" she asked. "How do I turn this into a real farm?" Joseph smiled, the first expression she had seen him make that wasn't careful neutrality. "That," he said, "I can teach you." The work took 3 years. Ingrid couldn't afford to hire labor, so she did most of it herself, with Joseph's guidance and occasional help from his nephew, who was young and strong and willing to work for meals. They built dikes around the most productive sections of the bog, creating contained pools where the water level could be controlled. They dug channels connecting the pools to the creek that fed the swamp, allowing them to flood the bogs in winter to protect the vines from frost and drain them in spring to let the sun warm the beds. They cleared the debris and dead vegetation that choked the wild vines, giving the cranberries room to spread. They transplanted healthy vines from the most productive areas to sections where the plants were sparse. They built a simple wooden scoop for harvesting, modeled on a tool Joseph's grandmother had used, that could gather berries without damaging the vines. The first real harvest came in September of 1882. Ingrid waded into the flooded bog at dawn, the water waist-deep and cold, and began raking the floating berries toward the shore. By noon, she had filled 3 barrels. By sunset, she had 12 barrels of cranberries sitting on the bank, more fruit than she had ever seen in one place in her life. Carl Lindstrom rode by that evening, curious about the activity he had seen from the road. He found his sister-in-law standing beside a stack of barrels, soaked to the waist, exhausted but smiling. "What is all that?" he asked, not dismounting. "Cranberries. 12 barrels from the first section alone. I'll have 30 more by the end of the week." Carl stared at the barrels, then at the bog, then at the woman he had given worthless land to 3 years earlier. "There's no market for cranberries. You'll be lucky to get $2 a barrel. The buyer from Chicago offered me $8 a barrel yesterday. He's coming back on Monday with a wagon." She watched Carl's face cycle through disbelief, then calculation, then something that looked almost like anger. $8 a barrel for 30 barrels was $240. More than Carl's wheat crop would bring that year if the prices held. More than the swamp was supposed to be worth in a lifetime. "The market won't last," Carl said finally. "Cranberries are a novelty. People will get tired of them." "Maybe, but they haven't gotten tired of them yet. And I have 60 acres of bog that you gave me because you thought it was worthless." Ingrid smiled. The same kind of smile Carl had worn when he handed her the deed. "Thank you for that, by the way. It was very generous." Carl rode away without another word, and Ingrid went back to stacking barrels. She had work to do. The market didn't collapse. If anything, it grew. Cranberries were becoming popular in the cities, shipped east by rail to Boston and New York, where they sold for prices that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier. The fruit kept well, lasting months in cold storage, and it had a tartness that people craved after a diet of preserved meat and stale vegetables. Doctors recommended it for digestion. Restaurants served it with game and poultry. The demand increased every year, and the supply couldn't keep up. Ingrid expanded her operation steadily through the 1880s. She bought the bog on the adjacent parcel when the owner died, and his heirs wanted cash instead of swamp. She hired workers for the harvest, paying them fairly because Joseph had taught her that people who were treated well worked harder. She invested in better equipment, better storage, better transportation to get her berries to market before they spoiled. By 1885, she was shipping 200 barrels a year to Chicago, Milwaukee, and points east. The money was enough to rebuild her cabin into a proper house, to buy good clothes for the first time in her life, to put money in the bank against bad years that might come. She was, by any reasonable measure, successful. Carl Lindstrom's wheat farm was not. The 1880s were hard years for wheat farmers in Wisconsin. Prices fell as production increased across the country, and the cost of labor and equipment rose faster than the returns. Carl had expanded aggressively in the early part of the decade, buying more land, planting more acres, borrowing against future harvests to finance present operations. When the prices dropped, he couldn't make the payments. The bank foreclosed in the spring of 1886. Carl lost everything: the land his father had cleared, the house his grandfather had built, the wheat fields that 3 generations of Lindstroms had farmed. He stood in the yard on the day of the auction and watched strangers bid on his equipment, his livestock, his life. Ingrid was there. She bid on one item only: a small writing desk that had belonged to Eric's mother, the only piece of Lindstrom family furniture she had any attachment to. She paid $12 for it and had it loaded onto her wagon without speaking to Carl. But Carl spoke to her. "You could have helped," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been shame or might have been accusation. "You have money now. You could have given me a loan, helped me save the farm." Ingrid looked at the man who had given her 60 acres of swamp because he thought it would kill her or drive her away. The man who had laughed when she refused his $50. The man who had spent 6 years telling everyone in the county that his brother's widow was a fool for trying to farm a bog. "I could have," she said, "but you never asked. And I don't recall you offering to help me when I was wading through cold water in a patched dress, trying to figure out how to survive on land you thought was worthless. That was different. You had the swamp. I had a real farm." "You had a real farm," Ingrid agreed. "And now you don't. And I have 300 acres of bog that produces more per acre than your wheat ever did." She climbed onto her wagon and gathered the reins. "I learned something from this land, Carl. I learned that what looks worthless to one person might be treasure to another. You looked at the bog and saw swamp. I looked at it and saw cranberries. The difference between us is that I was willing to get wet." She drove away, leaving Carl standing in the yard of the farm he had lost, watching the wagon carry his mother's desk to the house of the woman he had tried to destroy with kindness. Joseph Clearwater died in the winter of 1889, peacefully in his sleep in the cabin he had lived in for 50 years. Ingrid paid for the funeral and spoke at the service, telling the story of how he had found her wading through cold water and taught her to see what was already there. She told the story of his grandmother, who had harvested cranberries from these bogs for 40 years before any Lindstrom set foot in Wisconsin. She told the story of knowledge passed down through generations, from the Ojibwe to a Swedish widow who was willing to listen. She named her company Clearwater Cranberries in his honor. By 1895, it was the largest cranberry operation in central Wisconsin, shipping berries across the country, employing dozens of workers during harvest season, producing wealth from land that wheat farmers had dismissed as waste. Carl Lindstrom moved to Milwaukee after the foreclosure, finding work as a clerk in a grain warehouse. He died there in 1902, never having returned to the land his family had farmed. His obituary mentioned that he was survived by a sister-in-law in Wisconsin, but it didn't mention what she did for a living or how she had come to own 300 acres of the most productive cranberry bogs in the state. Ingrid outlived him by 23 years, dying in 1925 at the age of 69 in the house she had built on the edge of the swamp that was supposed to be her ruin. She had never remarried. She had never needed to. The bog gave her everything she required: income, purpose, and the particular satisfaction of having proven everyone wrong. The Wisconsin Historical Society has a photograph of her taken in 1910, standing in one of her flooded bogs during harvest, surrounded by workers raking cranberries toward the shore. The water is waist-deep and red with floating fruit, and Ingrid is smiling, her sleeves rolled up, her skirt soaked, looking exactly like what she was: a woman who had learned to love the water that everyone else feared. The caption reads, "Mrs. Ingrid Lindstrom, founder of Clearwater Cranberries during the 1910 harvest." It doesn't mention that the bog in the photograph was given to her as an insult. It doesn't mention that her brothers-in-law expected her to drown in it or flee from it. It doesn't mention the 60 acres of worthless swamp that became 300 acres of agricultural gold. But the cranberries remember. They grow there still, tended now by a corporation that bought the operation in 1968. The bogs are larger, the equipment is modern, but the water is the same water, and the berries are descended from the same wild vines that Joseph Clearwater showed a Swedish widow more than a century ago. Some stories end with the protagonist getting revenge. This one ends with something sweeter: a woman who took the land no one wanted and made it produce more than anyone imagined, who built an empire in a swamp while wheat farms failed all around her, who proved that the value of a thing depends entirely on who's looking at it. If this story of unexpected harvest resonated with you, consider subscribing for more narratives of overlooked abundance. What is the swamp in your own life that everyone has dismissed as worthless? And what would happen if you waded in and looked for what was already growing?